Now we're going to talk about group validations in OneForm. I'm just showing here, this looks like, oh my God, what's going on? I'm just showing what we did for validations last time. We took validations, we passed it here. Today we're going to talk about group validations. And still, this doesn't matter, but it's important. You need to know if you're validating on change or submit. I think the default would just be change, but I don't know if I want to force people to pass this in. That way they have to be explicit about what they care about. Then if they have to pass it in though, then this only matters if you're validating anyway. If you're not validating it, it doesn't matter. You don't need to pass this in. Everything in OneForm should be optional, as far as I remember. Then validations took a field name and an array of validations. Then you would give it an error message and a validate function. How's group validations different? Group validations takes groups of fields. And because of that, you're giving it an array. It doesn't have an object like this that it deals with, because there could be multiple fields. And how would you know? What you do is you give it an array of objects. You could make your normal validations like this. I just wouldn't recommend it. That's literally why there are two ways of doing validations. There's validations and group validations. I would say the API is pretty clean, but it's more complicated than doing the other way. And if you want your validations to be clean and easy to understand, most people do field level validations. They don't do group level validations. This is better. But just like before, we would have a values, something like this. Now you're wondering why this is an object. I'm pretty sure you do. And I'm not going to go into that because it's with like dynamic fields and whatever. I'll worry about that when I have to put it all together. I don't want to talk about anything with dynamic fields right now because it's way too complex. There's some dynamic fields that we talked about, but I don't want to go too deep into it. We want a validate function, but this isn't going to work. And I think day validation is the easiest thing to talk about because I've done it before. This would be like a day validation. Let's say you need a year and you need a month. And you're like, where's year and month and whatever? Well, I'll show you that. How about, let's not do that. Let's make it simple. Let's name it first name and last name. How about that? That's a really good one. But you will always have a last name. We're not gonna have that be optional. It can be optional. We're just not going to. Pretty simple. OneForm, group validations, validation type. We have a OneForm field. It has an input with a name, has another input with a name. These are just standard HTML inputs. I mean, you could put your own in there and it will still work. This could be text input and this will still work. It does have to take a name prop. And if you need to translate between it, there's a way to do that. I just haven't developed it yet. I say there's a way. None of this has been developed open source. It's all been developed closed source. I have to do it from scratch, and that's why this whole thing exists. We're subscribing to these field names, and we do pass in the string of the name prop. And that is actually very important because these are static. And this whole group validations is static. You make it once, and you can change it. You can pass in more stuff, but you don't need to. And it will work with dynamic fields, even though it is static. I know that seems ridiculous, but it will. You have a validate function just like before. What we had before was like email, and then there was an error message, and then there was this thing. This should also have an error message. But the error message doesn't exist like a prop on it. It's going to be the return value of validate. Validate is actually most likely. And we're going to check to see if you have a first name and you have a last name. If you have both of those, then we wouldn't display a validation message. What we really need to do is something like this. If not first name, then we're going to return. Now, I'm going to do a mutation here just to prove a point, but I don't like the mutation. Errors equals, boom. It returns an array of error objects. And I know that seems weird. And I really don't know how I want to do it. Now I'm thinking about it. But basically, like you could say if you error on the first name, like your error is first name, it would take an array of error messages. Whoops. Stuff like that. But that's not the idea I had, because normally you're not going to have multiple errors for a single one. In the group validations, you'll have still a single error. It looks a little bit different the way you export it. Errors would actually be an array. And because of that, you would do .push. And that's why I'm saying I don't like the mutation. I'm just doing it here to prove a point. We could do concat and some other things to make it better. There are better ways of writing this logic. I'm just showing you how to do it very simply, in a way that most people would understand. If there's no first name, we want to push an error. The error is going to be an object, and the object is going to have an error message. This might look really familiar to people. You need a first name, and you're going to wonder here in a minute what's going on. Field name or name, however you want to put it. It could be field name is equal to first name. Something like this. You would push this error, and then when it returns, it would display an error message on the first name. And you're still wondering, how would it display the error message? It would display the error message on whatever custom component you have here, or it would do it on something like this. This is how it would display the error. You would have to build this component. So here, I built one. If you want to display error messages, like I can't assume what that's going to be. I can pass you the values of all the error messages with OneForm field into your component, but I cannot, assume how you're going to make it look. That's not something I would know. This is like another way you could do it. And like I said before, you could wrap these into whatever. So it doesn't matter. Like where these are located inside of OneForm, it doesn't change anything. Still thinking about this. You'll return an array of objects, and the objects have a field name or a name prop and an error message. The reason it would be field name here is so it's not the name of the error. That could be confusing for people. That's why you put field name here. All these name props are field names. That's essentially what they are, but you don't know that. This is a little bit different, this object, from the other objects that we're using, but there's a reason for it, is that internally it's easier for me to process an array than to process an object, because I have to convert it to an array anyway. That's why I do it this way. It's probably easier to write it as well, to just push an error into an array like this. It should be much easier and cleaner to do it that way, and then mutations are less problematic when you're doing it this way, because most likely the only mutation you're going to do is a push. You're still wondering, like, why have a group validation? I can just validate they have a first name or a last name. But that's not what you're going to do. No. You're going to check if the first name is not equal to the last name. And now I'm writing first name and last name, and this is completely wrong. It's values.firstname and values.lastname. It's from this values prop that you have access to a first name and a last name, because these match these. All these are in here. When you're doing this, that's how you would do it. If your first name and the last name don't match, now you can put the error where you want it. You either have it on the first name field or both fields. Why not? Just put it on both fields. I wouldn't use a merge like this. Let me copy that out. I would just return right here. I'd just return it right there. An array of 2 errors. Meaning that way you can see it on both fields, depending on how your company wants to do it. And they can both have the same error message. Your first and last name cannot match. From your validate function, passed into group validations, subscribe to these 2 field names. Anytime either one of them changes, this validate function will get called. And you can check here that they are not the same. And if they are the same, oh my goodness. If they are the same, then you display the error messages. If they're not the same, you're good. As far as I know though, in group validations, you do need to return null. Because of some processing I do internally, I'm not exactly sure if this is needed anymore, but in the past this was needed. There is a reason for this. So something to keep in mind. This is what you're looking at. This seems very clean, very easy. You can just add to it, add props here as you need, and remove props as you don't need. Typically, we're using like all the props. When we write forms where I built this, and the forms are very complex, and there are dynamic fields and other things going on, but in terms of validations and stuff, we're able to accomplish everything we need with these static validations, which sounds ridiculous, but it's possible. Because this is an array, I can add another one of these if I really wanted to. The thing is, we only have 2 fields at the moment, so it doesn't make any sense, but I can add another thing that has another validate function that does other things, and it could even listen to the same values. And then again, you can save this and put it somewhere else. Most likely these stay with the form. Like every form would contain its own one of these group validations arrays. It's not like the field level validations where you can reuse them in other places. These most likely are not reusable. There are some that we do. I can think of some where if you have a date, this is the one that would be commonly previewed. Something like this, you have a month, day, and a year. You're just subscribing to these fields. And this is a very common use case where you have a day picker. Like you have a little drop down with a day, you have a month in it. And you also, in that same drop down, you would have a year drop down, and you're changing the values in these and whatever. But what's really important is when you display an error, how do you display an error for all of these fields at once? You don't want the error to just display on the month. You don't want it to display on any of them. You want it to display somewhere below it. You might have an error. You can even signify that all of these are in an errored state. That's another cool thing that we can do. I'll show you that. OneForm will tell your fields that they are in an errored state, which is like, what? Yeah. Right now, these inputs don't have an errored state. There's no possible way to do that. But the OneForm.field component will do that for you. If you had a component that was written with some props on it that could take that information. The field error would be something called, or you could call it birth date, or you can call it wedding date or future date, or I'm just trying to think of what's a good example. You want an error on the date. Basically, we can change this. I just want to modify it. Day, month, year, and you need a day, month, and year before we're going to even show an error message. This is really important. You don't want to show an error message until you have all values. You don't want to display an error message, say, I selected the month, boom, there's an error. No, I need to select the day. Give me a sec. All of these fields have to be touched. That was another thing I forgot to mention, is with validations, all fields have to be touched before the validate function even runs. If the field is not in a touch state, it will not run any validations unless you submit the form. If you submit it, everything's go. Everything becomes touched at that point. And it's touched forever at that point. The fields are only ever touched once. Once they're touched, they're never untouched. You can't untouch a field. It is touched, it's touched forever until you like reload the page or something like that. And depending on how you have everything set up. If you have values day and you have values.month, and these could be integers. If these are integers and you get a 0, that's going to mess it up. But in this case, they're strings because that's how I'm doing it. Most likely all values are strings. If I remember correctly, all values are strings. Yeah. We have to have an ampersand. But if you don't have them all, if you're missing one of these, now remember, this only runs when you've done all the stuff. If you don't have a day, or you don't have a month, or you don't have a year, after you've touched all the fields, then we would display an error message. And we want the error message to display your date wrong. Yeah. And we want to display that error message on the date field, which is this one. Now, the interesting thing is that I want all of these fields to turn red, or at least be in an errored state. I want to know there was something wrong with it. So I can return the field name of every single one of these fields down here. I know this seems weird, but you can totally do it. It is very cool. All of these fields now have been returned, but there is no error message. But it doesn't matter if there's an error message or not, because they're in an errored state. I can signify to the field itself that they're in an errored state. Now, I don't want to go into detail about how all that works yet without implementing it, but this is pretty cool. You're basically saying which fields you want to error. And so every object returned can potentially have an error message, because you can error on each field differently. But this is where the strength of the group validations comes in. You can subscribe to all these fields, wait till they're all touched, and you don't have to do that here. That's done by the form itself. This is what I mean is validation is built into OneForm. You're just checking your thing to see if all these exist. You can even check fields that you're not subscribed to, but you shouldn't do that. Just React hooks. Think of this like the second argument to React hooks. It has to be there. If you don't keep these the same, you can get into weird situations. If I remove day here, this is not going to work like I expect. Yeah, and basically these are all in the error state now, because I didn't have a day or a month or a year after they had all been touched. You could even do it if the year is invalid, right? I don't want to go into detail about how I'd calculate any of that, but if the year is invalid it would be the day is invalid for the given month and year combination, you could do that too. And that would also return, and you would want to have all of them in an errored state, or just the day in the error state. Maybe in that case, you just want the day in the errored state. These are the different things you can do with it. I'm remembering a lot about how this API works now. It's funny. It's like, I came up with this API, we built it, iterated it, and I really haven't touched it. And the only thing I really did since was like make a spreadsheet a couple hours in the night to show how it worked, like how powerful it is. This is really cool that I'm going through it and detailing it, because I have to build this again, but it's going to be really cool. I think these solves a lot of problems for people. Look how simple this looks. You could just see your fields here. They're all so simple. And then if you want to explain errors, there it is. And you can put all this in a div and put all this in the div. And there you go. Yeah, you can wrap this in the div. You can put them wherever you want. This field could be like over here. It doesn't matter. The form still works the same. It doesn't matter. It allows you to compose however you want. And then over here, you do everything with static. It's not static analysis, it's static operations. And it's still probably wondering, how does it work with dynamic fields? If you have fields with different IDs, you have to pass them all in here, right? No, it's not how it works. I can go into that a little bit now, but I don't want to spend too long on it because I think it's a complex topic. If you think of subscribed field names as actually subscribed validation names, then that should make it a little bit more obvious what's going on here, is that these are names of groups of components, but your components can be part of a group. And you can even prefix them. It doesn't actually matter if you prefix them or not. This would be like example form.month, whatever. I can export these fields, and I can even export static group validations that I can concat in. I'm showing you how you can do dynamic fields. I can take this, I can create a component out of it. All of this right here. I can create a component out of it. And it could be, it doesn't have to be example form now. It could be like something fields, date fields. It's a date fields input that I'm adding into my app with a date warning. Let's see, date warning. There, date. Yeah, we could just call it date warning. It doesn't matter. I'll get into dynamic fields in a second here. This field name is created on the fly. There is no input that has this name. That was the important thing I wanted to explain. is that for this field error, this is a field in terms of OneForm. OneForm sees this date warning as a field. If you wanted to display it in an input, you could. I could display date warning in an input. It would work, but I don't need to because I want it to be an error and I want it to display and I don't want it to be an input. I don't want somebody to edit my date warning. You're seeing some of the state management parts of OneForm by seeing that you can create fields randomly that don't exist in the page, and it won't validate them because they're unregistered. Okay. Pretty cool, huh? Yeah, because this is not considered a registered field. These are registered fields. Now we're going to talk about a little bit into dynamic validation. So one of the things you would do is you could prefix these and you can put them in a separate component. They wouldn't even be part of this form. They would be in my right example code here. They would be in another component like this that would be called date fields. They would be in a separate component. So they're like this. And I forgot my error. The date warning should be in here. And we need a fragment to wrap them all or something like that. I'm going to wrap them in a fragment. Most likely these will have styling, so they'll be wrapped in a div. Okay. There you go. There's your date fields. And you can render a date fields. But what if you have multiple date fields? Yeah. And what if you're dynamically generating these date fields? That's the kind of stuff you're thinking about. In this case, I'm just going to show you how you do it this way. Because even if you're dynamically generating them, it would be the same. If you had a plus icon and you have to create a new one, it would be the same kind of thing. These date fields would take an ID prop. And the ID prop would be some GUID. I don't know what it's going to be here, but I'm just going to make the ID 1 and 2 just to be very simple. And in here, you would take that ID prop and you can now assemble that as part of the name. Now, the reason we prefix these as date fields assigned with this is because we don't want namespace conflicts. If something else has a month in it, we want this to be the date fields month, not some other month. It's the one that is related to the validations that we're going to run on these. That's important because when we give validations, like I said, they're static. You would want to match these names in here. And you're like, this group validations is going to be in this component. Yeah. No, it goes in this component and you export it down here. At the bottom of your component, you would do OneFields.group validations. You don't have to export it this way. It could be like an exporter. I'm just showing you an example. You export default date fields or group validations. And then when you pass in group validations here, it could be date fields.group validations. Or it could be your group validations, but you can concat in the date field group validations. You can concat them in the object. It doesn't matter. At this point, I'm just going to do it like this so you can see it. It's the group validations for date fields. Yeah. And you can just put as many of these as you want. This is going to return an array of objects. That's the way they can keep track of each other there. And then I'm trying to really remember how I did this because this is the hardest part. And this is the part that I got to rewrite. This is going to be really tough. We're running out of space here. The name field is going to be what's a little bit weird. I'm going to rewrite it as a JavaScript piece just so I can show you how it's different. We have datefields.month. Yeah. And we're going to concat onto datefields.month. We're going to concat in an ID. And the ID is going to be called the date ID. We can name this whatever we want, but we have to name it something because in this validation function, there are some things that get passed in and we need to know what this is. And that's why you put these group validations in this file because you need to know what the heck this is because you're looking for it. Now I'm going to strip off some other things in the, whatever you get back in here in this validate function, but you need to know what this is because you need to define it here. You need to know the group ID of date ID. You need that. And then I can be able to look it up in the code and do some magic. Basically, these are, like I said, these are validation names, not really field names. The API we have right now is this. I'm thinking they should be validation names because it's confusing if I say it that way, but these are the field names, but then there's all this data behind it. So I'll just put field names. I can see that argument. You have the subscribe field names just like normal, but they're prefixed. And the only reason they're prefixed is for namespace conflicts. You don't have to prefix them. And this is all wrong anyway. That should be a string. There we go. And then you have a group ID, or you could have multiple group IDs. I don't know how I want to handle this, but I'm pretty sure I want multiple. But doing the code for multiple is a little bit more complex. And the way we would do it is that basically I can see if any of these fields change, and then I can find the one with that particular ID and only run the validation against the group the group of fields with that particular ID that changed. Yeah, hopefully that explains a little bit about how you can do dynamic field validation. That's probably the hardest part about all this. And it's hardest with group validations. It's easy with field level validations. because every field name, you don't have to worry about the slash. And so you're just validating a field, and anything with date fields month anywhere would be validated that way. But here, date fields month plus day plus year, but in a group has to be validated a certain way. I called it date ID, but it should be like, I don't know, date field ID or whatever we want it. But it's basically this ID. You can track a group of fields together, and they don't have to be in a separate component. I'm just telling you how to make your code cleaner. They absolutely don't have to be in a separate component. All those fields here could be in here, and there could be like a .map function, or you could duplicate them, whatever. But in this case, then this should be a template string. Man, dude, keep forgetting stuff. Where this ID is, you just put one here. You can hard code it. It doesn't even have to be written this way. I'm just showing one way to write it. Hopefully that's helpful and shows you how there's a lot of thought that's gone into this, and it takes it even a step further. And again, validation is built into OneForm, so we need to solve a lot of these problems. And that's one of the important pieces of it. Cool. That's the end of it.